This video is going to be my midterm review of the 2019 Giant Trance Advanced 29. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that currently I'm testing two 29er trail bikes, a shorter travel one, which is this one, and then a longer travel, which is the 2019 Specialized Stump Jumper, which has 150 millimeters of travel in the front and 140 in the back. So in this video, I'll talk about how this bike has performed over the last couple months, and then I'll talk about how I feel a short travel 29er trail bike fits into mountain biking. I'll start this review by looking at the components and talking about how they've performed. This bike is equipped with a SRAM Eagle drivetrain and SRAM guide brakes. The drivetrain has performed absolutely flawlessly. No drop chains, no misshifts. The nice thing about SRAM Eagle is from the NX all the way up to the XX top of the line, they all pretty much work the same and you can interchange the components. It's just the higher end components are going to be lighter. So the GX is just above the NX, and I think this is kind of the sweet spot for value. I've had no complaints about the guide brakes. I've used Shimano for many years. Now I have three mountain bikes with SRAM mountain bike brakes, and unlike the road bike brakes, which I complain about because it's very hard to adjust them and keep them centered, I've had no problems with the mountain bike brakes. My preference is I actually prefer SRAM for shifting and Shimano for braking, but I still really don't mind these brakes. They don't have quite the initial bite that Shimano have, but they have really good modulation. And again, after using SRAM brakes on all three of my mountain bikes, I've become really accustomed to the feel and actually really like the brakes. I found the gearing on this bike to be really good. It has a 30 tooth in the front. If I had to build this bike up from scratch, I probably would put on a 32 because I ride a lot of times in flatter terrain when I'm hammering on a flat section, like for example on the road. So I can only get up to maybe about 23, 24 miles an hour before I start to spin out this drivetrain. But the 10 to 50 in the back provides plenty of range. The dropper seat post on this bike is just buttery smooth. No issues at all with performance. You can regulate the speed of the return of the seat post. Like if I push the lever down just slightly, I can make it come up really slow, or if I slam the lever down, it'll pop up real fast. So I really like that. Not all dropper seat posts have that capability. I'm a huge fan of Maxxis tires, and I have not been disappointed with these Minion DHFs. And it's actually got a DHF in the front and a DHR in the back. What I like about these tires, not only do they have a ton of grip, but they also roll really well. So if you're riding on pavement going to the trailhead, these tires are pretty quiet and roll really smooth, but you don't give up anything with the traction. Also, I want to mention that the tires and rim combination work really well. I've had no issues at all with air leaking out. You can pump these tires up and not have to touch it with a pump for a week or two. I like these wider rims. So this is a carbon rim. These rims just, I mean, they're solid. I love carbon rims. I've said it over and over again. I love the stiffness and the precision and the snap that you get with these carbon rims, and I don't feel like these are overly harsh. And of course, I am running these tubeless and no flats at all, no air leaking out. So, you know, having wheels that perform is really important. It's kind of one of those things that when they're working well, you don't really think about it until you have problems. All right, now let's talk about the suspension on this bike, and we'll get into how this bike rides. So this fork is the Fit Grip Damper, and obviously it's a 34 millimeter stanchion fork. Really good spec on this bike. I love Fox forks. And the nice thing about this fork is you could, in theory, put a plus tire in the front, a 27.5 plus, and so it's pretty versatile. What I like about this fork is how easy the compression knob moves. It is so easy. I have a Fit 4 damper on my cross-country bike, and it's harder to move. This is just effortless. And so all the way over there is going to be fully locked out, and then you can just, as you move it counterclockwise, it's going to be less and less compression damping. So that's fully open, fully plush. I generally will run this bike kind of right about there. Obviously, if I'm on the road and want to lock out the bike, I'll move it there. But for trail riding there, and if I'm up in the mountains riding, which I have not taken this bike up into the big mountains yet, but I would open it up fully on a descent. I absolutely love the fact that Giant spec'd a Fox DPX2 shock on this bike. This shock is so good. It is just plush. It has a really good pedaling platform. Now I mentioned it before, so if you put this knob all the way back, so counterclockwise, it's going to be fully open, and There is going to be kind of the middle setting to give you some pedaling platform. And that is not fully locked out, but it's pretty firm. I would not ride that on the trail. Now, what I've mentioned before is the fact that this shock is pretty firm in that middle setting. So most of the time, if I want small bump sensitivity, I will just run this shock in that position, so fully open. Giant Maestro does a really, really good job firming up when you're pedaling. So even when you're out of the saddle, sprinting up a hill. Now, this bike only has 115 millimeters of travel. If it had more, so maybe 140 like my Specialized stump jumper, I would probably run it in the middle setting for the trail riding. But with only 115 millimeters of travel, you can easily get away with this shock in the open position and rely on Maestro to firm up when you need it to. I've heard several reviewers say that this bike rides like it has more than 115 millimeters of travel in the back, and I'm going to have to agree with that. And the reason is because this suspension is absolutely buttery smooth. It has excellent small bump sensitivity. Where you feel like the bike runs out of travel is when you do drops. So especially if you're doing a drop onto a flat section. I was riding, kind of doing some urban riding over in St. Augustine, and I came off a wall that was about 4 to 5 feet high on the flat ground, and you could really feel the suspension bottom out. Also, I was riding where I was doing a drop off a wooden platform onto a landing that had a transition, but it was a little bit rocky, a little bit uneven, and I really bottomed out this suspension. Those are the applications where if you had more travel, it would be more plush. But if you're just riding and you're not hitting really, like I said, big drops or really big hits, this suspension is so smooth. So if you'll allow me to do a little bit of comparison with the Specialized Stump Jumper 29, I feel like this suspension feels more plush when I'm riding on trails that don't have big hits or drops. Like I said, it's when you get into the situations where you're doing a really chunky rock garden or coming off a drop is where you're going to appreciate more travel. The stiffness on this bike is good. It's full carbon, so whereas older Trances, especially the 27.5, have an aluminum rear end, this is full carbon, which really helps in the stiffness. The front end feels stiff too. This Fox fork is also fairly stiff, especially since it's got boost spacing and through axles. Now I'll wrap up the video by talking about how I feel this kind of short travel 29 trail bike, or you might want to call this a mid-travel 29er if you're comparing it across the whole spectrum of 29ers to include cross-country bikes. So this bike with 130 millimeters of travel in the front and 115 in the back, we'll call it a short travel 29er trail bike. And I think after riding this bike for a couple months, this would be the one bike if you were going to have a bike that you want to do some cross-country stuff and then get into some rougher stuff. The geometry on this bike, the slacker geometry, gives this bike just a feeling of confidence when you jump on. I immediately felt comfortable on this bike. The Specialized with a little bit longer travel, sitting up a little bit taller, I felt like I had to get used to that bike. Once I did, I was railing that bike. But this bike, I felt more comfortable right from the start. I like this, slacker geometry without having a lot of travel. It gives it a lot of pep, a lot of snap. So if you're, like I said, doing some more cross-country stuff where you're wanting to ride fast, sprint out of corners, stand up out of the saddle and go up a steep hill, this bike will move, but yet it still has that confidence feeling. So when you hit the rough stuff, when you hit those rock gardens that kind of throw your handlebars around, this slacker geometry gives you just a ton of confidence when you're riding. And this bike, by the way, is about 28 pounds without pedals. And that's a weight that you're not going to win an elite level cross-country race on this bike. But what you could do, if you wanted to race pretty competitively, you could get a high-end wheel set. For example, the Stan's Valors. If you got a carbon cross-country wheel set with lighter tires, you're going to drop a couple pounds on this bike, and not just a couple pounds, but a couple pounds of rotational weight, and have this bike to be fairly competitive. So with another wheel set, this bike could easily double as a cross-country race bike. That's one thing that I am going to do, I have not had time to do yet, is put on my cross-country wheels on this bike and then go do some laps and compare it to my full-on cross-country race bike, which is a Niner RKT9. So like I said, this kind of short travel 29er trail bike segment, I think, is going to be probably the most versatile segment of bikes if you're wanting to own one bike. And you know, Specialized has their short travel stump jumper. Niner has their Jet 9 RDO. All of these bikes have about the same amount of travel. And you know, I think, again, if I were going to own one mountain bike, this would be it. Now, fortunately, I'm in the place in my life where I can have 2 mountain bikes, or right now 3. And so my cross-country mountain bike has 120 millimeters of travel on the front. And so it's only about 10 millimeters less than this one. So I actually prefer having more travel for the trail bike since I have a cross-country bike. But again, if I didn't, this would be the bike that I would have if I were going to have one bike. So that's going to wrap up my midterm review of the Giant Trance Advanced 29. I'll follow this video up later with a long-term review, but I need to get up into the high mountains. I've been riding on this bike on some pretty rugged terrain. So even though it hasn't been long descents, they're pretty rough and technical, and so it's a really good sample of what a long descent would be like. So in my reviews, I will point out things that I don't like about bikes. I honestly can't find any critical thing that I would say about this bike. What I do hope to see is in the future, Giant continues their progression of 29er trail bikes and makes a longer travel Trance, or maybe they'll call it a Rain 29. But if they continue this progression, we're going to see some really good bikes in this 29er trail bike market. So as always, questions or comments that you have about this bike, about this review, go ahead and drop those below. Do you have this bike? Have you demoed it? What do you think? I'd love to hear. Thanks for watching.